What I'm talking about today is the artist formerly known as Arnold van Bronckhorst. In fact, my title is slightly misleading because the artist formerly known as Arnold van Bronckhorst does exist. There is still an artist known as Arnold van Bronckhorst, and that was his name. But as so often happens with 16th century artists whose oeuvre have been put together in the middle of the 20th century, recent research has fractured him into at least three separate artists. And before I go any further with my fracturing of Arnold, I want to thank Charlotte, who's been a big star of today, whose work, along with other colleagues at the National Portrait Gallery in the Making Art in Tudor Britain project, has really formed the basis for my paper, and more on, basically they did a lot of analysis on Arnold van Bronckhorst, and I will be distilling that as I go along a little bit. Charlotte also gave me some useful comments early on my ideas, and I also want to thank David, who first suggested a very important change of identification of the sitter in a portrait that I'm going to come to further on in the talk. So, this is in fact the only portrait that we know to be by Arnold van Bronckhorst, and that's because it's signed A.R. Bronkhorst Beckett. This portrait now belongs to the National Portrait Gallery, and it forms and has always formed the basis of his oeuvre, which was initially put together by the great Tudor historian of the mid-20th century, Erna Auerbach, and she grouped a number of other paintings around this one. And then Roy Strong continued with that group of portraits. A more up-to-date biography than Erna Auerbach's of Arnold van Bronckhorst is provided by Ed Towns' excellent biographical dictionary of London painters, 1547 to 1625, which was published in the 2014 volume of the Walpole Society. And if you're interested in painters of this period, it's a really fantastic resource, Ed's biographical dictionary. So I do recommend that, and that again came out of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project. So to summarise the bit of Bronkhorst's career that's of relevance here, Bronkhorst was based in London, of a Netherlandish background, and is recorded as travelling from London, where he lived, to Scotland in the late 1570s, or more likely about 1580, on behalf of a gold prospecting partnership formed between himself, Nicholas Hilliard, the miniaturist, and another artist who seems to have been related to him called Cornelis de Vos, but about whom we know very little. So Bronkhorst went to Scotland on this gold mining expedition. In Scotland, he fell foul of the Scottish regent, the Earl of Morton, and Morton did not allow him to export the gold that he found and compelled him to become the painter of, quote, all the great and small pictures for King James VI in 1581. I feel there's more to this story than we're actually told here, but that's all we know. Bronkhorst then was paid for painting 3 portraits in 1580, 2 of James and 1 of James's tutor, Buchanan, and he was back in England by 1582, and in 1584 he's replaced in his employment in Scotland by Adrian van Son. Now these dates are quite important to my argument, so I sort of ask you if you could try and bear them in mind. Around 1580 this is all happening, in the early 1580s. Erna Auerbach's group of paintings that she attributed to Bronkhorst included 2 English portraits, a portrait of Lord Burleigh, signed A.B., and a portrait of Henry Sidney, for which there seemed to be a payment to somebody called Arnold. Neither of these now seem to be by Bronkhorst, and I'm not going to deal with them today, so I only mention them to kind of chuck them out. It's a group of Scottish pictures that Auerbach associated with Bronkhorst that I want to talk about. And these are linked by circumstantial evidence to the artist, and they have a connection with Hardwick, and I will come on to those next. So, this is James Douglas, 4th Earl of Morton, whose name's come up as the regent a minute ago, and King James VI, who was, of course, a child at the time. They were associated with Bronkhorst, these paintings, for fairly good reasons. First, Morton was the person who compelled Bronkhorst to start working for the Scottish Crown. Now, Morton was regent of Scotland from 1572 to 78. He was arrested for treason at the end of 1580, and he was executed in 1581. And it's just possible that Bronkhorst, if we believe that he came to Scotland around 1580, it's possible that Bronkhorst could have painted Morton in 1580, but it seems more likely that Morton had his portrait painted during his period of power from 1572 to 1578. And in fact, there's a head and shoulders version of this portrait of Morton which is dated 1577, so that tends to confirm that as the date, roughly, for that picture. James, who of course was the son of Mary Queen of Scots, was born in 1566, crowned King of Scotland in 1567, and of course eventually became James I of England in 1603. And as part of Bronkhorst's employment for James, he was paid for 2 portraits of the king, a half-length and a full-length, in 1580. Now, in 1580, James was 14. So quite clearly, this portrait is not either of the ones that was paid for from Bronkhorst in 1580. He's a much younger boy, and the versions of James's portrait that Charlotte showed earlier, the full-length versions of him with the bird, both of those, the NPG one and the Hardwick one, I think, are dated 1574. So that's significant too. In terms of the relationship between these 2 portraits, you can see that the handling is very, very similar, and I will talk more about that in detail in a minute. But just going back to the dates, it seems very likely, certain in the case of James, and very likely in the case of Morton, that they both predate Bronkhorst's time in Scotland. So we come on to these 2 paintings, which have also been associated with Bronkhorst. James Hamilton, 2nd Earl of Arran, and Duke of, now I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, Châtellerault, I suppose, had been governor of Scotland and tutor to Mary Queen of Scots as a young man, and in fact was heir presumptive to the Scottish throne before the birth of James VI. So he's a pretty central figure in the Scottish court. Now, it seems to me that Arran has some of the characteristics of Morton and James in terms of the drawing of the hands and of the face, but the handling of the paint is very different. And again, I'll talk more about that in a minute. The condition of this painting is obviously compromised, but it's also possible that it seems to me that this is a copy by another hand, of a probably contemporary copy of a lost painting by the same artist as the previous 2. Arran was probably painted, it seems to me, between 1573, which was the moment when he accepted James VI as the rightful monarch, and I'm afraid I got very confused about Scottish politics around Arran. It seemed incredibly complicated. And he was restored to his patrimonial lands and then in 1573 when he accepted James as the monarch, and then he died in 1575. So again, unless this is a posthumous portrait, this has to date from earlier than Bronkhorst's visit, or this type at any rate has to date from earlier than Bronkhorst's visit to Scotland. George Buchanan was a poet, public servant, tutor to James VI, again, central in that group around James. And Bronkhorst, we know, was paid for a portrait of Buchanan in 1580. Now, Buchanan's portraits are incredibly difficult to assess because they're all really quite bad, like this. And it seems to me that they probably all represent a copy of something that was better, but that no longer exists. So I'm slightly taking him out of the equation. I mean, I think it's possible that there is a link, but I just think we can't make that link on the basis of the evidence we have at the moment for Buchanan. So here we have heads of the signed authentic Bronkhorst, Lord St. John of Bletsoe, Morton and James VI. It seems to me that when we look at details like this, Morton and James VI grouped together form a natural pair, if you like, and St. John is completely separate. And the technical analysis that Charlotte and her colleagues did as part of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project, which they did on these 3 paintings, absolutely made that very, very clear. I don't think there's now any doubt at all that this painting was produced by a different artist from these two paintings, which seem to have been produced by the same artist as one another. So, Lord St. John, just to give you a very brief and crude and possibly misleading, apologies Charlotte, overview of the technical findings. Lord St. John had thick lead-white priming over chalk ground on the panel. He was painted, and I'm quoting somebody else here, in an orderly, painted in a very orderly way with very fine brushwork, very rapid, but fairly rapidly painted. Although parts of it are quite thinly painted, it's nothing like as thin as the other two in the way that they're painted. And the pigment mixtures, for which we do have details, are completely different from the other two paintings. Morton and James, on the other hand, were painted in a very, very similar way, almost identical way. Very, very thinly with the ground and priming lightly skimmed over the panel, a warm brown underlayer applied beneath the costume, but flesh paint applied directly onto thin, pale priming. The dark costumes of Morton and James have very similar mixtures of pigments, including blue azurite in them, and the brushwork, where it wasn't worn, was very fine wet and wet blending in places, in tones and details. They're both, basically the technical evidence for these two pictures is extremely close, and for this one, it's very, very different. So I'm now showing in large details, and you can see this brown colour showing through under the white of the ruff, which is very, very similar on these two pictures. Aaron is different in terms of handling, but in terms of the drawing, the stylistic aspects of Aaron, it seems to me that there are some similarities. This artist, who I hope we've established is not Bronkhorst on the basis of my rapid run-through, has this very characteristic way of painting the eyes very far apart, with quite a lot of emphasis on shadows under the eyes, bags under the eyes, if you like, both on Morton and on James, the young child. And Aaron has this too, very far apart, very similarly drawn eyes, which I think is quite characteristic and quite distinctive in relation to these two, particularly to these near two paintings of Morton and James. You can see that the ruffs are very similar. I think that the handling, which is not the kind of polished handling that you get on the portrait of Elizabeth that we were looking at earlier, but a more fluid, broader kind of handling, suggests to me a southern Netherlandish artist. But beyond that, I don't think I can really go, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. One of the most distinctive features of this artist is this very strange drawing of the hands. And in a way, I think it's more obvious, if I just go back to where you see them, the hand in relation to the body. I mean, they have these incredibly short, fat fingers, very, very tapered. And it's so distinctive. I think if you saw another painting with a hand like that, you would instantly recognise it. Aaron's hand is modelled in, it's shaped in the same kind of way, drawn in the same kind of way, if you like, but it's not modelled in the same kind of way. And I don't know whether, as I say, that's because it's a later copy, or a copy by a different artist of something that was originally by this artist. But you can see in this detail too, again, how thinly it's painted, how the ground, or the brown underlayer shows through now. The copies of James I'm actually not going to talk about very much. I was hoping Charlotte would say more about Lockie, but maybe, we can talk more about that afterwards. What I did want to say about these copies, the one in the Portrait Gallery and the one here at Hardwick, is that I think that they probably relate, well, they obviously relate to the Scottish National Portrait Gallery picture of James, which is my main focus of interest. But I suspect that there was an intermediary portrait between them. I don't think these are direct copies of this. I mean, apart from the fact that they're wearing a different costume and they're full lengths, it seems to me that actually James is younger in the Scottish picture. I think he's probably, the Scottish picture's probably 2 or more years before the other two. In 1674, which is the date of the copies, he would have been 8. I think he doesn't look like a boy of 8 in that picture. I think he's more likely to be about 6. I mean, it's not a big point, but given that the copies generally reproduce what they have in front of them, the fact that they put him in a different costume seems to me to suggest that there might have been something in between the two. It's possible that the picture that came in between the two was just an aged version of this portrait of James, and we know that artists did that, and that certainly happens with Edward VI. That James didn't necessarily sit for it 2 years later for another version of the same picture. An artist just made a picture of him looking a bit older using roughly the same composition. The difference in costume is something I'll come back to, because I think that there's a little bit more of a significance to that, a tiny bit more. So now we come on to my main Hardwick point, which is about this picture. I don't know if anybody other than me stepped over the rope and had a look at it when we walked past it this morning. It's very small. But I would like to propose that this portrait, called Henry Stuart Lord Darnley, is part of my little group of Scottish pictures, the James VI and the Earl of Morton. Henry Stuart Lord Darnley was, as you know, the second and very ill-fated husband of Mary Queen of Scots and the father of James VI. And I just put his head here next to the other two. He's actually less worn than these pictures, Morton and James. But if you look at the handling of the ruff, and again, we're just looking at slides here, but I think in the flesh, the ruff particularly is painted, although it's less worn, it's painted in a very, very closely similar way. The drawing of the eyes very far apart. In fact, the modelling of the nose between James and Stuart, very, very similar. The drawing of the lips, which have a very fine outline of the top lip, that, I think, is a blob of overpaint on the lower lip. I think it'd be really interesting to do some technical analysis on him to see whether what looks to me from a, if you like, connoisseurial point of view to fit into this group, whether it really technically fits as well. I think it seems to me that it's very plausible, and of course Darnley, as James's father, would be very closely part of this group. Which brings me on to the identification of the sitter. Now, David first suggested this to me, and I think he's absolutely right. I don't think it is Henry Darnley. I think Henry Stuart Lord Darnley. I think it's actually his younger brother, Charles Stuart. We know that in Hardwick in the 1601 inventory, there were 2 portraits of Charles Stuart. They're not really described in any detail, but there were portraits here. There'd be every reason for there to be portraits here because, as you know, he was married to Elizabeth Cavendish, and he was the father of Arbella. So we also know that there were portraits of his brother Henry here, but I think that Charles is more plausible for a number of reasons. This is a double portrait by Hans Ewer of Henry the older brother and Charles the younger brother. You see there's a big age gap, nearly 10 years between them. The important point from that point of view is that Lord Darnley was murdered in 1567, and if we assume, on the basis of the costume of the Hardwick portrait, that this dates from the mid-1570s, which I think must be right, then it has to, if it's of Henry Stuart, it's a very posthumous portrait, and that seems a bit odd. It doesn't relate to any other extant portraits of him. If it's a posthumous portrait, it's more likely to be a copy of a portrait from life, and there's no evidence for that. So I think it's probably got misnamed. We now know that lots of the portraits here had their names transferred or added at a later date. But I think that this is much more likely to be the younger son, Charles, who, again, if we look at the dates, Charles Stuart was born in about 1556. He was created Earl of Lennox in 1572, and he married Elizabeth Cavendish, Bess of Hardwick's daughter, in 1574, and then died in 1576. Now, if we assume that the boy in this portrait is a teenager, I would say 14 at the youngest, but perhaps more likely 17 or 18, that gives a date range of 1570 to 1573 to 4, which would fit very well with Charles Stuart, both in terms of his age and his biography. And what I would propose is that this is a portrait painted in about 1574 to mark his marriage to Elizabeth, and that therefore it fits from a chronological point of view with the other portraits in this group. So, who was the artist? Well, that's a question I can't answer, and those of you who know about Scottish 16th century portraiture will perhaps have better suggestions. I think, as I said, that I would be tending to look for a Flemish, a southern Netherlandish artist from this period. I've wondered about various connections with Bronkhorst. There's the mysterious Cornelis de Vos, Bronkhorst's relation, but de Vos seems to have been based in London, and we need somebody who was in Scotland in the 1570s. I think further research into the young James VI court could throw up possible names. It'd be interesting to know what payments there are from that time. But I think in the meantime, and I hope you agree, we can argue for a coherent group of works, including the Hardwicke portrait, painted in the circle of the young king, James VI, by a distinctive artist who was not Arnold van Bronckhorst.